curator at the Arizona Historical Society here in Flagstaff at the Pioneer Museum. So welcome, we're so glad that you're joining us tonight. I'm gonna do a quick intro and then I will hand things off to our speaker and our moderator so that we can start the presentation. So thanks for coming out and joining us virtually. For this talk, I'll take credit for that, a Mary Colter presentation. Let's see. So you're going to hear from two people other than me today. So our moderator is Jill Huff. She's the curator here at the Pioneer Museum for the Arizona Historical Society. And our speaker tonight is Haley Johnson, who is on the Grand Canyon Historical Society Board of Directors and has done a lot of research on Mary Colter. So I'll let Jill more formally introduce Haley in a bit, but I just wanted to go over a couple more things. The Arizona Historical Society, if you're not familiar with us, we've been around a while. We were established by an act of the first territorial legislature on November 7th, 1864. We're the oldest historical agency in Arizona. And you can see on the map here, we have 4 locations across the state. Our mission is connecting people through the power of Arizona's history. If you haven't seen it yet, this is our new license plate. It just got redesigned. So if you're in need of registering your car or getting a new license plate, you can get this beautiful monsoon design. And then some of the profits from the plate go to support the Arizona Historical Society. So thank you if you do that. 2 of our museums are open right now. They're open limited hours in Tucson and in Tempe. So check that out on the website. You can get your tickets online at azhs.org/tickets on our website. And you can buy them ahead of time to go to those 2 locations. These are 2 of our big museums at those exhibits at those 2 museums. So down in Tucson, we've got Barry Goldwater's ham radio, which is pretty large and impressive. And then in Tempe, the Still Marching exhibit about suffrage and the Me Too movement and a lot of other stuff in between. Our library and archives is also open if you need to do some research. So you can contact them to make an appointment to come in. It is limited, but if you need to do some archival research, they're happy to help, and they can also help you out via email or over the phone. These are some upcoming talks, so mark your calendar and register for these online if you are interested. February 3rd, Where Water is King and the Shadow is Queen, is all about water rights in Arizona. And then February 10th, we're going to be talking about preserving Arizona COVID-19 stories. We're part of a team across the state to keep those stories and keep them in our archives. So future generations, when they research this time, will have a lot of information to do their research and build on. And if you're not a member of the Arizona Historical Society, we'd love it if you joined us. There are some of the perks on the screen. So you'll help us by supporting and preserving history. And you'll help yourself by getting a discount in the gift shop and free admission to all our museums across the state. And also you'll get our wonderful Journal of Arizona History in the mail. Here it is again. The Journal of Arizona History is now available on Project Muse, so you can access all the articles from home online, which is pretty cool too, because they do take up some space in print. There are lots of them. We've been publishing it for many years. And then visit our website if you have other questions or you want to read our blog. We put up some history on there. We have activities for kids on the website, all sorts of things. And of course, the upcoming events. So azhs.org, and stay in touch with us. I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will disappear But if you have questions during the presentation, throw them into the chat box and we'll be monitoring that to ask them at the end. Again, while the speaker is talking, please keep your video off and yourself muted so that we have, she has our full attention. And then at the end, when we do questions, you can unmute and you can share your video if you would like to. So again, I'm Sasha Siskonen. Thanks for joining us. And now I'm going to throw over to Jill Huff and she will start the program.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's very snowy in Flagstaff. For those of you who are here, we love it. I wanted to let you know that this is a program that was scheduled to take place last July, and obviously it didn't happen. It was supposed to be outside. It was supposed to be kind of a beer-hosted fun talk. And we weren't able to do that. So now we're kind of in these little boxes and we're still gonna have a good time. I'm glad that you're all here. You know, when I first arrived in Flagstaff nearly 25 years ago, I had recently retired from historic preservation consulting work in Oregon. When I got here, I became absolutely enamored with Mary Jane Colter, to the point where I actually visited Grand Canyon National Park multiple times with sketchbook in hand, camera around my neck, drawing, painting, and photographing Coulter's credited work up at the canyon. But upon hearing that Coulter may not have been who she is presumed to be, my heart sank a little bit, but I became excited at the prospect of an academic battle for the truth. That battle rages on today. Our speaker tonight is Haley Johnson. She's an Arizona-born Grand Canyon guide. She established herself early on as a passionate member of the Northern Arizona community after moving to the South Rim of Grand Canyon National Park nearly a decade ago. In 2016, she was elected onto the Grand Canyon Historical Society Board of Directors and subsequently became vice president of that organization. She's worked as a National Park Service volunteer, a hiking guide, a bicycle guide, and even a Jeep tour guide. And her personal adventures have taken her to remote parts of the canyon on 3 river trips down the Colorado River. As a Grand Canyon guide, she always had conflicted feelings when it came to the story of Mary Jane Colter. Without further ado, I'm going to sign up, and here's Haley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. Before I get started, I'd like to say thank you to Jill. Thank you to everyone who put this event together and for inviting me to speak tonight. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and get this going here. There we go. Okay. So many of you might be familiar with Mary Jane Colter and her iconic buildings at Grand Canyon, or maybe you're here to learn something new. Perhaps you're a friend of mine who's just here filling seats. Thanks, guys. No matter what your reason for being here tonight is, I really appreciate each and every one of you. Your being here tonight really is evidence of your open minds, your curiosity, your love of history, and for that, like I said, very grateful. Without people like you, without people like Jill, the past could easily be forgotten, and that is something that must never be allowed to happen. So throughout this presentation, I do encourage each of you to leave polite and respectful comments and questions in the chat box, which is available in the Zoom meeting box here. But please leave main discussions and questions to the very end. That way we don't miss anything. So without further ado, hold Hold on one second here. There we go. Tonight, we're going to be cramming 100 years of history into a 40-minute presentation. We're going to discuss 2 different books about Mary Jane Colter. We're going to learn a little bit about who she was, some of the buildings historically attributed to her, and throughout the entire program, I'm going to introduce you to some fascinating new views. So, did Mary Jane Colter falsely claim to have been one of the greatest female architects of her time, or was it a matter of misinterpretation? And if so, who were those true architects? So Virginia L. Grattan was a teacher and an author of 2 books. The first book she wrote was Mary Colter, Builder Upon the Red Earth. And the second book was a 1993 biographical dictionary of American women songwriters. So Grattan's book about Mary Jane Colter, Builder Upon the Red Earth, was originally published in the year 1980. It was pretty much the first biography on Mary Jane Colter and her career as a Fred Harvey company architect and designer. So the back of Grattan's 132-page book has about a 2-page bibliography of published material, 1 page of other sources, a list of interviews. Some of those interviews took place 20 years after Coulter's death. It seems that Virginia Grattan's book impressed so many people with all of her research and facts, and her very well-written book, actually. That book has been cited more than any other book ever written about Mary Colter. So Virginia Grattan's book seems to be heavily based on a document written by Mary Colter in 1952, when she was around 83 years old, no less. In the early 1950s, a request was made for Mary Colter to send in an autobiographical summary to the National Park Service for potential inclusion in the Stephen T. Mather collection. So Coulter wrote up her autobiography. She sent it in a couple months late. She was never actually included in the Stephen T. Mather collection, by the way. Her hand-typed resume mentions her first work at the Hopi House. It doesn't say what she did. It mentions starting work with Fred Harvey in 1902, working on plans with Charles Whittlesey, who was Fred Harvey's chief architect, by the way. She worked with him supposedly on plans for El Tovar. She has yet to claim to be an architect in her autobiography, though. She does mention 2 years in Seattle developing a decorating department. She finally says designed and superintended the building of all Fred Harvey hotels. This line could absolutely be taken out of context and make us think that she was in fact an architect of some sort, but she still never says, hey, I'm the architect. Oops. She finishes up by listing all the Grand Canyon buildings she worked at. The only 2 spots in her own autobiography where Coulter claims to be an architect was at the heading of her letter there. Let's see, there we go, it should pop up. So right at the very beginning, it says position Fred Harvey, retired architect and director, and then first position, architect and director. So in the last 40 years, no less than 200 other published works have used Virginia Grattan's Builder Upon the Red Earth book as a primary source for all things Mary Colter. So now I'll introduce you to False Architect, the Mary Colter Hoax, which is a book written by Fred Shaw. It's 942 pages, and you will find 200 pages of citations, a 100-page bibliography. This is over 3 years of research, thousands of archival pages, countless contemporary primary resources. The book even has digital copies of the original architectural drawings, and it goes above and beyond by diving into handwriting analysis. So I'm sure many of us here have heard of this book. A few of us, I'm sure. 100 years ago, I'm sure we all know this, 100 years ago, our society did not have Wi-Fi. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have Facebook or next day mail delivery service. The daily news was reported in newspaper articles instead of nightly television or Google News. It's quite amazing the amount of social business the newspapers covered back in the day. The author of the False Architect book, Fred Shaw, he found letters, interviews, newspaper articles and all sorts of other things. He wasn't actually researching Mary Jane Colter, though. He was researching another architect by the name of Lewis Curtis. But Shaw kept running into the name Mary Jane Colter over and over and over. He thought he'd found another phenomenal female architect from back in the day, but what he uncovered was a treasure trove of mystery, and as it turns out, it was quite controversial too. So let's get down to the basics. Who was Mary Jane Colter? I'm sure we all know to some extent who she was, but just in case you don't, Mary Jane Colter, she is famous for having been the chief architect and decorator for the Fred Harvey Company throughout the early 1900s. She has been credited with the designing of some of Grand Canyon National Park's most iconic and historic buildings. She was born in 1869 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her family moved and settled to St. Paul, Minnesota when she was 11. Mary Colter went to St. Paul High School, graduated in 1888 at the age of 19. This right here is a newspaper article from her graduation commencement of 1888. Almost every book you read about Mary Colter says she graduated high school at age 14. That would have been in 1883. There's articles from the St. Paul Globe newspaper of June of 1888 that mentions Miss Mary E. Colter competing for and winning a spot to deliver her own essay during the graduation commencement of 1888. This one right here mentions the contest for competitive commencement parts resulted in the choice of the following essays by the committee at the foot of Mount Parnassus by May Colter. May Colter, of course, was another very common name for Mary Jane. The first article also mentions Mary Colter wearing a white Swiss dress while reading her essay to her graduating class in 1888. And I'm sure we've all seen this dress before. So maybe her age upon graduating high school was misinterpreted over the decades, or maybe Mary Colter returned 5 years after she graduated to deliver an essay to that year's graduates. Why would newspapers claim she had to compete for a position to speak, though? I'll let you guys decide that. In St. Paul, Minnesota, Mary Colter was hired on as a drawing teacher, which is like today's art class instructor. She taught high school in St. Paul full-time for 10 years until 1907. In summer of 1902, Mary Colter was hired by the Fred Harvey Company for a brief time to decorate the interior of a new building in New Mexico. The Fred Harvey Company, by the way, was the owner of the Harvey House chain of restaurants, hotels, and other hospitality businesses along railroads in the western United States. Today, many of their hotels are still run by a concessionaire by the name of Xanterra. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at these iconic and historic buildings that are attributed to Colter here. So this photo right here is from Virginia Grattan's Builder Upon the Red Earth book that I mentioned earlier. It's a list of buildings designed by Mary Colter. The list continues to the top of the next page there. The most famous of these buildings are here in Arizona. I'm sure we've all been to them before. One thing I find really interesting about this page that's up right here is the very bottom, and it very kindly reminds us that other buildings have been attributed to Mary Colter erroneously. That little footnote right there easily could have been the title of Fred Shaw's book. But where did Virginia Grattan get all this information for her book anyway? That would be from her 1952 autobiography. So some of the most iconic Colter buildings, as I mentioned, are here. Lookout Studio, Desert View Watchtower, the infamous Bright Angel Lodge, places we've all been or hope to have visited at some point in our lives. The Hopi House was built in 1905, and Hermit's Rest in 1914 are also said to be Colter designed buildings. These two right here are my personal favorites, and we're going to dive into them head first. Here we go. So Hermit's Rest is the furthest west building at Grand Canyon's south rim. It has always been my favorite place to take my tours while guiding. I'd tell them the story of Mary Colter and how she designed it to blend in with the landscape and how she meticulously designed the arched fireplace inside. every book you find about at Grand Canyon about Mary Colter mentions her having designed Hermit's Rest. And then along comes this false architect book, and it really challenges everything we thought we knew. This book, False Architect, claims that Hermit's Rest was actually designed by a guy named Lewis Curtis. So Lewis Curtis was the chief architect for the Santa Fe Railway. And we're going to dive into a little bit of his work here. So buildings seem to kind of inherit certain characteristics from their architects, similar to the way like a father's red hair and green eyes might pass on to his child. Favored design traits from certain architects can show in their buildings. Lewis Curtis had these favorite features, these identifiable features in most of his buildings. The most obvious is this one here, and this is a bracketed arch design. In our Hermit's Rest, the stone brackets support a log above the entrance, the main entrance. You can see it right there, clear as day. The Union Depot in Joplin, Missouri was another one of Lewis Curtis's design buildings. And it sports this really cool bracketed arch right there in that entranceway. I thought that was pretty cool. These aren't the only two examples of this. I think we found, Fred Shaw helped me out here, and we found about 17 or so or more examples of this. So here's another one right here. The fireplace at the L. Ortiz and the windows at the Wellington, Kansas Harvey House. These are also prime examples of this favored design of Lewis Curtis's. And they match up with the entryway of Hermit's Rest almost perfectly. So we're going to move on to another favored design of Lewis Curtis's. And when I pull up this next photo, I want you to think of what comes to mind, especially those of you who have guided at Grand Canyon or have lived there. What do you imagine? What comes to mind? You can type it in the chat box. You can keep it to yourself. Doesn't matter. It's fine. This beautiful archway right here is a stone and mosaic tile entryway arch from Mineral Hall in Kansas City, Missouri. And you guessed it, it was designed by architect Lewis Curtis in 1903. I asked the same question, what do you see when you saw that last arch? And most of my friends instantly were reminded of this stone arch at Hermit's Rest, this stone fireplace here. So I'm just going to rewind that really quick so you can see that. Go ahead and look at the stonework right there. And then the stonework right there. I'll let you guys decide. So moving on. Each of us can easily search the Kansas Historical Society Santa Fe Railway collection for Hermit's Rest. In that collection, we can find 3 architectural drawings for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company. They show side and cross sections of the Hermit Point shelter at Grand Canyon's south rim. This shelter design from around 1912 is similar, but not exact to what we have today at Hermit's Rest. The log timbers, the local stone, all the same materials. The roof is almost exact as it was, exact in the drawing as it is today. In the lower right-hand corner, if you can see it there, as is common with most professional architectural designs, we can see the architect's name and who they created the design for. This one reads, for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, Lewis Curtis, architect, Kansas City, Missouri. Moving right along. We're going to leave Hermit's Rest. We're going to head east, and we're going to take a stop off at the Hopi House. So the infamous Hopi House is in the heart of Grand Canyon Village. It's situated right on the rim. It's nestled between Verkamp's Visitor Center and El Tovar Hotel. There are at least 7 biographers and historians that state Mary Colter was the architect of Grand Canyon's beloved Hopi House. We've all known this to be true. Some accounts credit Coulter with having been present to oversee the actual construction of the Hopi House. Construction of Hopi House was set to begin August 25th, 1904, according to a personal letter from one Reverend Heinrich Voth, who I'll mention later. At the time this building was being constructed, Mary Jane Colter, remember she was a full-time school teacher until 1907, she probably should have been in school as the St. Paul Public Schools opened for the new school year the first week of September. So about a week after this building started being built, she would have had to have been in her classroom. I think that's pretty interesting. So Hopi House was being built from late August 1904 until around January 1905, when it opened. So would a full-time school teacher willingly bail out of 4 months of her job? And would a higher up allow her to do such a thing? I mentioned Reverend Heinrich Voth. It turns out this is the person that Fred Harvey Company chose to oversee the actual construction of Hopi House. In 1893, Reverend Voth established a Mennonite mission in Upper Orabi in the Hopi Reservation. I apologize for that. Hopi House was designed to replicate a Hopi dwelling, and the Fred Harvey Company requested Reverend Voth, for having lived with the Hopi people for 10 years, he would have known how this kind of building should be built. So this October 22nd, 1904 newspaper article from Williams, Arizona states, H.R. Voth, missionary at the Hopi Reservation, is here to oversee the construction of the Indian Curio building. So, over 100 years of history books and decades of experts have told us that Mary Colter was the architect of Hopi House, but False Architect book claims she was not. So if it wasn't Coulter, then who done it? The Hopi House architectural drawings in Grand Canyon National Park's museum collection seem to give us the truth. Fred Shaw ferreted out sketches and perspective views for the proposed Hopi building, planned in connection with Grand Canyon Hotel, also known as El Tovar. The next slide is going to be a zoomed in version of the top of this photo here on the left. It clearly states the date this design was drawn and the architect who designed the building. So these drawings are dated June 22nd, 1901, 1 year before Mary Colter's own handwritten autobiography claimed she worked for the Fred Harvey Company for the first time. In the middle, we can clearly read W.H. Moore, architect. W.H. Moore was a staff architect in the Santa Fe Railway's Los Angeles office. Moore's designs were refined in early 1903 by his colleague, Santa Fe Railway architect, Charles Whittlesey. So how did Coulter get associated with the Hopi House to begin with? It turns out she did in fact visit the Hopi House in December of 1904 during her Christmas break to assist in decorating the interior of the Hopi House. Local news articles report she spent approximately 10 days assisting with the interior decorating of the Hopi House. Again, this was December of 1904 during school teacher Coulter's Christmas break. So according to multiple sources, the Hopi House was designed by W.H. Moore, a Santa Fe Railway architect. His designs were refined by Santa Fe Railway chief architect, Charles Whittlesey, and Mary Colter was one of the many decorators of the building's interior. So the Desert View Watchtower is another one of these controversial buildings that has Mary Colter stamped all over it. This interesting stone tower is the furthest east building on Grand Canyon's south rim and the last stop before visitors can exit the east entrance of Grand Canyon National Park. The east entrance is currently closed, by the way. The east entrance to the park at Desert View remains closed because of COVID-19 lockdowns on the neighboring Navajo Nation. So the gate is locked. Please do not enter from that side. Thank you. So right on the rim of the canyon, the Desert View Watchtower resembles the architecture of the ancestral pueblos of the Four Corners region. The tower was said to have been patterned after cultural sites found at Hobenweep and the Round Tower of Mesa Verde and others. Mary Colter was said to have considered the watchtower not a reconstruction, but a recreation of the prehistoric form. The idea for the tower itself is often said to have been Mary Colter's concept. However, a January 1907 article from the Colorado Springs Gazette mentions ancient cliff dwellers' ruins to be reproduced in Manitou. So these folks disassembled entire cultural sites, entire structures, moved them by train to Manitou Springs, Colorado, where they reassembled them and turned them into kind of a tourist destination. And it's still there today, I believe. It has some pretty bad Yelp reviews, unfortunately. So how does this connect to our beloved Watchtower? Fred Harvey executive J.F. Huckle and his wife, Minnie Harvey Huckle, would vacation in nearby Colorado Springs, and they probably witnessed truckloads of tourists dropping all their money at these gorgeous ruins. So one can easily assume that Huckle wanted his own cliff dwelling type tourist destination at Grand Canyon. Where else would it be? So there are even multiple articles that Fred Shaw dug out saying as such. So basically what I'm saying is J.F. Huckle have dreamed up the idea of having some sort of an ancient looking structure at the east end of Grand Canyon. Now, if you look at these photos right here, they do kind of bear a resemblance to what we see on the South Rim. So do you think that the structures are similar? The final mystery that we have, the final mystery or the final wonder we have of Desert View Watchtower is Robert Ranny. Who was Robert Ranny? Who is Robert Ranny, Haley? Come on. Robert J. Ranny was Fred Harvey's chief architect from 1923 to 1942. According to multiple sources cited in the False Architect book, Ranny designed the Guadalupe Center in Kansas City, Missouri, La Posada Hotel in Winslow, Arizona, Phase 2 of Phantom Ranch at Grand Canyon, the latter two, of course, commonly being attributed to Mary Jane Colter. So in courts of law, handwriting comparisons can prove a person innocent or guilty. They can charge someone with a life sentence. On the left is Mary Jane Colter's writing from the Grand Canyon working plan sketches that she wrote on. On the right are comparisons of Robert Ranny's handwriting from the Desert View floor plans and from Robert Ranny's drawings of the Elizabeth School in Missouri. So go ahead and look at these pictures for a second here. Take a look at the O's and the E's. I'll give you a moment. The handwriting on the Desert View floor plans don't really look like Mary Jane Colter's on the left there. Like the O's and the E's, very, very different. I believe even the S's, if you look closely, there's quite a difference there. However, it does quite seem to match Robert Ranny's lettering. So it's a good thing we're not in a court of law, or else Coulter would have some explaining to do. So some folks have theorized that Robert Ranny sketched or signed off on designs for Mary Jane Colter for some reason or another. If Coulter was Fred Harvey's chief architect, why would she need someone else to sign off on her designs? Was it because women were not credited for their designs? There is an entire chapter in Fred Shaw's book dedicated to female architects from the early 1900s. I would love to go into that, but that would take much longer than my allotted time. So was it because she was not a licensed architect that her names are not on those drawings? Maybe, perhaps, but Arizona, the state of Arizona, did not require licenses for architects until 1921. Hopi House, Hermit's Rest, Lookout Studio, those were all built prior to 1921. So if those were actually built or designed, by Mary Jane Colter, those could have had her name on it if she was licensed or not. So no biographer of Coulter, Fred Harvey, or Santa Fe Railway has ever uncovered evidence of any such agreement where engineers or drafters would trace, sign off on, or bring Coulter's concepts to life. So surely an arrangement like that would have been written down for some sort of business records. There's so many questions left unanswered here. If you've read Virginia Grattan's book, you will have probably read this quote by Hopi artist Fred Cabote. He painted the amazing murals in Desert View Watchtower and also worked with Mary Jane Colter in the Painted Desert projects. He says, quote, "Miss Coulter was a very talented decorator, with strong opinions and quite elderly. I admired her work and we got along well most of the time. Former Grand Canyon Superintendent Minor Tillotson, also known as Tilly, wished to include Mary Colter in the National Park Service's Stephen T. Mather collection. I mentioned that before. She was not included. His quote says she was a decorator. And there is also a Newton, Kansas newspaper article from 1907 that begins, Miss Coulter, official decorator for the Fred Harvey Company. So we have many more examples of multiple people, multiple statements, articles, interviews of people saying Mary Jane Colter was a decorator, an interior designer, an interior decorator. Very rarely can credible sources actually call her an architect. So we don't have time to go through all those, unfortunately. So we've seen today a few different sources say Mary Colter was not an architect, but interior decorator. These gentlemen right here are the three men I've mentioned earlier along the way here, Charles Whittlesey, Lewis Curtis, Robert Ranny. They are the architects responsible for designing Grand Canyon's iconic buildings. Charles F. Whittlesey designed the 1904 Hopi House, along with Santa Fe staff drafter and architect William H. Moore. Lewis S. Curtis designed Hermit's Rest and Lookout Studio, as well as the 1922 Phase 1 of Phantom Ranch. Robert J. Ranny designed Bright Angel Lodge, Desert View Watchtower, and Phase 2 of Phantom Ranch. Feel free to take a photo or screenshot of this slide if you like. I'll wait. Fred Shaw's False Architect book. If you haven't read it, give it a read. It's great. It's very thought-provoking. It makes you mad and it makes you jump for joy. It was one of the, it's very much a textbook read, but once you get into it, you're gonna have a roller coaster of a time here. So this book states that Mary Jane Colter was never trained or certified as an architect. It claims that she falsely took credit for designs produced by others. In response to this provocative declaration, Shaw has been labeled a misogynist and a lunatic. He has received hate mail and threats to his person. Other people went so far as to threaten the Grand Canyon Historical Society for asking him to speak at their most recent history symposium. What is it that makes this new information so threatening to some, but so intriguing to others? History is full of ebbs and flows of what is considered correct, of what is considered fact. Historians are always finding new boxes of journals that change the way we see things from the past. Was John Wesley Powell the first down the Colorado River, or was it James White? Did John Wesley Powell's three men get killed by misled Native Americans or by Mormon conspiracy? Or are they just stuck in a canyon somewhere and we'll never find their bones? Did Mary Jane Colter falsely claim to have been one of the greatest female architects of her time? As historians, lovers of knowledge and truth, it is your duty to compare item A and item B with your own two eyes and help shed some light on potential historic discrepancies. That being said, I'm going to leave the case of Mary Colter in your capable hands. Thank you.
All right. I was sitting in my chair here at Pioneer Museum, just chuckling away and smiling and monitoring the chat. And there are a couple of folk in the audience that have a lot to say about this presentation. If you'd like to open it up to questions and answer time, I had a couple of questions on my own, but I kind of want to I think there's going to be enough momentum in the audience that we could probably have a lively conversation for probably the next half hour. I'm going to start first at the very beginning. Rose Hauk, our beloved local historian, was supposedly writing a book on Mary Colter, and I don't know if Rose is in this presentation in the audience or not, but Kathy, I don't know what happened to her book. I don't know if it's still slated for publication through Grand Canyon Conservancy or not. I don't know how to answer that question. Apparently, Mr. Arnold Burke is also in the audience, and he wrote a book on Coulter's work as well. And I don't know, Mr. Burke, if you wanted to unmute yourself and maybe ask Haley a question or share any kind of insight you might have from your work.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have some remarks to make, which are probably too long, but just let me start on them. I'd like to talk about biography. Lives of famous people are finite, but the writing about them is not. And so after the famous people have passed away, along comes somebody to write a biography of them, and then another biographer, and then another. And the earlier in history the notable live, the more biographies are written. These biographies add to the record, both factual and interpretive, and they often fine-tune or correct the record. Rarely do biographers claim that the subject fabricated his or her life achievements. This, however, is what Fred Shaw does with Mary Colter. He asserts that she made it all up. She claims she designed buildings that she did not. And Shaw thinks he knows who did design them, except he doesn't prove this. To call Mary Colter a fraud is not supported by Fred Shaw's findings. Shaw is a good writer. He is clear and forceful, but aside from a few cases where I would revisit my research, I am not convinced by his arguments. Much of what he asserts is supposition. If Lewis Curtis and Robert Ranny designed all the Mary Colter buildings, where are their drawings? His method is flawed, and for example, just to cite a few examples, in relating styles of buildings, as we've done in the talk tonight, the other architects designed to the styles of Mary Colter's buildings. That is not convincing. That happens out there in architecture, as I think a number of the chat commentators mentioned. Relating the architects' handwriting styles to each other and to Mary Colter's is another technique that Fred Shaw has used that I find flawed. Also, she couldn't make technical drawings, Mr. Shaw says, so she couldn't communicate what she wanted and certainly could not create architecture. Could she draw? I've seen concept drawings that prove she could draw. But such claims about her lack of drawing skills, about the lack of drawing skills of architects have been heard before. A recent New York Times book review about a biography of internationally famous architect Walter Gropius stated, Gropius is hardly alone in being an architect who couldn't draw. Shaw's book is larded with amazing claims, like she scripted the press coverage of her work by bullying reporters. Fred Shaw is very anti-journalist, except when these writings are helpful to prove his points. Another claim is that she inserted a laudable reference to herself in Minnie Huckle's Kansas City newspaper obituary, or she may have destroyed the drawings of Robert Ranny, one of the architects that is credited tonight, when helping close down the Fred Harvey offices in Kansas City. Or that Ranny was too much of a Southern gentleman to complain he wasn't getting the recognition due to him. I'll finish right now. The most startling of Shaw's assertions, though, is his theory about her personality. An entire chapter in his book speculates that Mary Colter suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, an official disorder, from a supposedly flawed and abused childhood. and that is what caused her to fabricate her role as an architect. Wandering into psychoanalysis is dangerous territory for a biographer. All in all, skepticism is in order here. Conspiracy theories, which seem to be very popular at the moment, routinely mutate fantasy into fact. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but that's my thoughts on the situation in general and some of the comments made tonight. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you for your insight, Mr. Burke. I'm going to move on to another question that was in the chat from Kathy, and she wanted to know if local Native Americans were used during construction of any of these buildings. And I can partially answer that myself because I have seen very, very recently, like in the last 48 hours in my own research, seeing historic photos of Native workers, likely Dene, Hopi, and probably Havasupai. But Haley, do you want to address that at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
So there are multiple news articles and reports from the building of Desert View Watchtower of Hopi laborers and Native Americans building that one, but that's the only thing I've read on that. I know there is someone who did a little more research in here, or who did a little more research. I believe his name is Fred. If he would like to mention anything on that, he can. But as far as I know, Native Americans did assist in the building of Desert View Watchtower.
Haley, were you calling on me?
Ooh, I think we have a guest that's behind door number 3.
Yeah.
Would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, I'm Fred Shaw. I'm the author of False Architect. I would love to address Mr. Burke's contentions, but first we'll talk about the Native American workers on the buildings. In fact, in my book, I have several photos from the collection of Bethel College in Newton, Kansas, from Voth's archive, and it's photos of him working with Native American workers at Hopi House. And so, you know, at least as far as the finish and the authenticity, they were involved quite a bit. There weren't really very many Anglo people showing up in that those photos.
All right, stay tuned, Fred. We'll come back to you.
Okay.
There was another question here, and it was actually one of my questions for Haley too. And this was William is asking Haley that your talk started with the first half of a story about you never being comfortable with Mary Colter when you worked at Grand Canyon, but we never really heard that story. So, you know, what was it about her being called an architect that made you uncomfortable?
So when I first started guiding at Grand Canyon, I was excited to see Mary Colter as, you know, that strong female figure. And I was really excited to kind of just follow along her story and learn as much as I could. She was really one of my favorite people to talk about when I was at Hermit's Rest. I mentioned that before. But then as I kind of got more into my own, I guess, comfort zone of being a Grand Canyon guide, I realized this was way too good to be true. Like, she graduated at age 14. She went and got all this experience as an architect, and then bam, she only designed buildings at Grand Canyon National Park. You know, like I mentioned, we right now we have all these buildings attributed to her. We have, you know, Lookout Studio, Hopi House, Hermit's Rest, Desert View, even Phantom Ranch. I believe even I think they attributed Victor Hall and the Brown Building to her as well at some point. And I thought to myself, well, why is it only these Grand Canyon buildings? Why only here? Why doesn't she have any garden variety? Or, why didn't she design someone's house 20 years ago or 70 years ago or whatever it was, why only these amazing buildings, these historic iconic buildings at Grand Canyon National Park? Why didn't she do anything at Yosemite or Yellowstone or anywhere else? And so when Fred Shaw's book came out, I really dug into it, and I've looked all the things, all the images I showed you tonight. I got them from him, but I dug into them myself. You can find most of them online, just by looking a little bit, and it's kind of frightening to see. And I'm not straight up calling her a liar. I'm just saying there was probably some misinterpretation over the last few decades. But for me, it was just really too good to be true. It's like, I don't know. I can't really explain it any more than that. It was just too good to be true. Who graduates high school at age 14? Come on.
I don't know. My son graduated at age 16. So, but back in the day, I can see your point. Everyone who is still in the audience, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on if you'd like, so that we can interact kind of in person. If you feel comfortable with doing that, go ahead. If you did want to speak up, maybe put something in the chat and then I'll call you out. If you've got a comment that you'd like to share with people other than just putting your questions in the chat, we can do it that way as well. Do you have another question? Are there any actual architectural drawings in any of Mary Coulter's papers that she left at Mesa Verde?
I personally never looked into Mesa Verde, but there is a huge Mesa Verde collection with her name all over it. You can easily access those simply by going, you can Google it. You can totally Google it. I'll pull it up right now if you want.
And Mr. Shaw, I don't know if you had done some research other than at Grand Canyon, but feel free to chime in if you know anything about that other collection at Mesa Verde.
I understand, from what I understand, it's primarily her books and, jewelry and that sort of thing that she donated, which apparently was quite a collection of the books. But, as Mr. Burke noted, about her and her books, in his books, that, she put her initials and her name on pages of things that she liked within the books. In fact, I wouldn't call her niece, but the daughter of Arthur Larkin, who was Coulter's good friend, said that when she and her mother went through Coulter's estate, they were amazed at how many times she'd written either notes or her initials or her name on pages of books that would have been very valuable if they hadn't been marked like that. Mm-hmm. So, she has a habit of that. And, I think the one thing that's really important for everyone to keep in mind is there are no architectural drawings with Mary Coulter's name on them. There's nothing. In fact, there's nothing that anyone from Fred Harvey's office in Kansas City, which incidentally is where all the architectural development was done, who referred to Mary Coulter as an architect. I actually offered a $10,000 reward for about 6 months of anyone who could come up with some contemporaneous primary sources that weren't from Mary Coulter that deemed her an architect, and there were no takers.
Hey, Haley, can you turn off your screen share so we can see the audience?
Sure, how's that? Better?
Uh-oh.
That looks good.
I don't know. I was really enjoying that picture where it just said Lewis Curtis,
All right. So where do we go from here? Is the National Park Service open to additional research? Is there going to be new interpretation? Are there any academics out there that are willing to follow your footsteps, Mr. Shaw, and check on your references or redo your research, or either agree to or refute your research?
I would welcome that. In fact, one of the kind of seminal Coulter works, in fact, it was earlier and predated Grattan's book, was by James Henderson, who was a student in Texas, and it was his thesis. And he took the normal line that Mary Colter was the architect and design. This was 1965. And I've recently had some correspondence with him and presented him with the evidence. And he is not convinced that what he said when he was a sophomore or, a grad student in college back in the 60s was actually accurate. So, I think there are people who are willing to revisit it. I think Haley made a very good point that no architect does just landmark buildings. That would be kind of a true anomaly. I think the other thing is I'm still looking to find primary sources that confirm the idea that Mary Coulter's an architect, was an architect. In fact, Virginia Grattan listed in her book quite a few references of, correspondence she had with people, 5 of whom actually worked at Fred Harvey. One of them, when Mary Colter did, they were her co-workers. None of them referred to her as an architect. They all talked about her as being a talented decorator, which she was. And she was also good, I think, with a budget based on some of the correspondence I read from John Gawmeem's archive on La Fonda. But there's nothing in there that refers to her as an architect. In Grattan's collection at the University of Arizona is a recording of an audio interview that she did with Charles Coverley, who worked at Fred Harvey from 1923 to 1926 before he moved to Chicago to go to work for the Grand Canyon or for the Santa Fe Railway, where he retired in 1968 as the chief architect for the railway. He says directly on there twice, Mary Colter was not an architect. He says she could not draw. He said she couldn't visualize. And this was someone that worked in the architecture department at Fred Harvey and also worked for the Santa Fe during the time that structures such as Bright Angel Lodge and the Watchtower were built. So there's nothing there. And I think Mr. Burke did an admirable job coming at me, but I'm still waiting for someone to produce anything from Coulter's co-workers in Kansas City that calls her an architect.
I think I've got Linda here, who has been very chatty in the chat box, and she'd like to speak about 2 buildings. Go for it, Linda. Let's see what you have to say.
Thank
I
you.
feel like a talk show host. This is crazy. I don't want to be a talk show host, but.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about the Grand Canyon Working Plan, which is from was written in 1916, and Hermit's Rest and the Lookout were both constructed in 1914. And the working plan says that that Coulter designed and supervised construction, which would require her to be at the Grand Canyon and be seen presumably by many people during that time of construction. And so I accept that as a primary source. I know that Mr. Shaw says that she must have told the report writer, she must have been the only source of the report writers, but I didn't see any support for that. I didn't see where he had gotten that information from to support that premise. And I also just wanted to talk for a minute about the nature of architecture. So I'm an architect, and I've also done quite a lot of research in this area. And I would say that around 1900, and when people were not, when not every state required licensure, it just started to pick up around that time. there was less of a bright line between architecture and art. And Coulter did start out as an artist, and you would say those two buildings are very sculptural. And also that architecture is a collaborative endeavor. So I've also read the work with John Galmeen. I've read the correspondence on La Fonda, and Coulter is the decorator on that project. He's definitely a decorator on a number of projects. But in that project, she also is she's making suggestions about redesigning the floor plan and things that are architectural of nature. So I think that sometimes people have a very narrow view of what architecture is, but there's many positions. Legally, she could not call her, legally today, you cannot say you're an architect unless you're licensed. So you could, and I'm not sure how long that's been true. But I would just say that it's a collaborative activity, and it's rare that one person does everything on a project. And it just, and I think on some projects she was involved in different ways. I would agree that I have not found a lot of information to support her as the designer of Hopi House, but I would also say that everything that I've read has said it was taken from an existing building in that Hopi mesa. So, it was appropriated anyway.
Haley, Mr. Shaw, would you like to comment on that, or does anybody else want to chime in? Let me know in the chat.
Actually, this is Fred. I would like to comment on that. Linda, I think if you go back and you look through John Galmeen's 3,500 page archive on La Fonda, you will see that John F. Huckle, who was the original Fred Harvey's son-in-law, married to Minnie Huckle, Harvey Huckle, contributed just as much, if not more, than Coulter to the design suggestions, and so did Hunter Clarkson as well. But I don't see anyone calling them an architect. And
I'm suggesting that let's broaden this. So maybe she's not. I'm just thinking that architects design. What distinguishes draftspeople from architects is that they design things.
Right. So Linda, where are her drawings for anything?
Well, where are a lot of things? There weren't any. She did not do the working drawings. The people who signed the drawings were the architects or engineers for the Santa Fe, because it was their buildings, they owned the building. And it's often true, I have designed buildings, and my name will be nowhere in the record. My original sketches do not exist anymore because the working drawings were stamped and signed by my employer.
But Linda, at the same time, did your coworkers say that they'd never seen you draw and you couldn't?
My boss, who's never drew, he would just redline drawings that I drew, and he still said he was still the designer officially.
Okay.
So I think that you have to think about a little differently about architecture is not just being able to draw a building section. It's also design. There's drafting, right, and there's drafting skills, and there's lettering, and then there is design. And it also is a multiple person effort.
Well, Linda, I think there's no question about it. There were draftspeople that worked at Fred Harvey and for the Santa Fe Railway. But you didn't, Charles Whittlesey had quite a name. He was a bit of a star-architect for his day. And relatively, Lewis Curtis was too in the Kansas City area. Curtis did a lot of work for the Santa Fe. He did a lot of work for William B. Story, who was wound up being the president of the Santa Fe Railway, designing the Topeka Club, which is a social club, and the country club. He redesigned Fort Harvey's personal residence in 1910. He redesigned the Huckle's residence in 1912. He was active with the Fred Harvey people and with the Santa Fe. And, there's no evidence anywhere that Mary Coulter designed anything. I mean, you think about it. The fact that if you
Well,
say
what
she
about the
no,
Grand Canyon Working Plan from 1916 that states she designed and supervised
Okay.
construction on both the Lookout Studio,
Linda?
and Hermit's Rest? You can't.
Okay, guys,
you have-
I'm going to cut you guys off. This is great, but there's a lot of other people who have some other
that's
questions.
okay.
So
We'll
let's move on.
Can I make another comment?
Damian Klenko's got a question. How do you reconcile the various contemporary primary news articles that credit her as the designer and architect for many of these projects?
Where are they? From like Hermit's Rest or from Lookout Studio?
He also put in the chat, refer to the Williams News, June 28, 1935.
Correct. And there was a fellow, oh God, I forgot his name, who gave an oral history interview, who, I forget exactly what he did, worked at the park, and he befriended Mary Coulter, and he himself said that he would send off articles based on what she told him about what she was doing at the canyon to various newspapers. And that is likely the source. He specifically mentioned like the Phoenix Republic. And, you know, if you think about it, those aren't primary sources.
He says Coulter did not go to college.
Those people weren't there. You know, they're taking secondhand information.
Well, what does she mean by that? California thing was not college.
So Damon, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe get in on the debate, because you just put something new in the chat as well?
Well, I think there's a variety of things that are important to note. I mean, one, there are numerous reports of her work, and in different contexts. This particular article from the William News talks about an event of an opening and that there was a reception at the Bright Angel Lodge and calls her out as the designer and architect. But I think more importantly, I think it's important to look at other female architects of the same period and how they and their work has been documented or not. I think Annie Graham Rockefeller in Southern Arizona, who is, I think, a really excellent parallel. You know, she worked for a firm, Henry Jostad here in Tucson. Very few of the drawings have any reference to her. They carry his name, but it's through her family's particular documentation that those buildings were able to be ultimately directed and attributed to her, because there were a cache of records that happened to be saved and that weren't tossed. But the canon of work isn't clear and direct. And so it's a concern to me. And frankly, I actually find it to be slightly misogynistic that we would have this sort of a revisionist view and sort of try to claw back attributions that were made to somebody throughout their life into the contemporary period, and really recognized as one of the premier iconic female powerhouses of design in the early 20th century.
I think that you really need to kind of reconsider the misogynistic, because the fact that you're saying essentially that women can't BS as well as men is kind of a reverse misogyny in its own way. There were women architects active. Like I said, Haley mentioned, I had a pretty good sized chapter in the book about them. Many of them whose work I admired. There was Julia Morgan in the West Coast, even in Kansas City. There was Nell Peters and Mary Rockwell Hook. And all of them had some actual drawings somewhere. And in fact, even in the case of the woman that you mentioned who wasn't, you know, publicly credited, she had drawings of things from what you're saying. And correct me if I'm wrong. Hello?
I mean, the drawing, I mean, I mean, again, the drawings are who actually, whether it was a draftsperson in the office or whether it's her, not entirely clear.
But did she have drawings of concept drawings of buildings in her papers that you mentioned?
Photographs, other documentation. You know, I'm not her biography. I'm not her scholar. I've just
Right.
personally looked at it.
Well, see, that's one of
The
the
bigger
problems.
concern is that you're just washing over some of these contemporary articles. You have a rationale that, oh, there was somebody who worked for the Park Service who was pushing out PR and press, and therefore all of the contemporaneous articles from the period are illegitimate or they don't reflect her actual design capacity. That's questionable.
And we do have in the museum, and I think somebody else had put this in the chat as well, at Northern Arizona University Klein Library Special Collections, they have some collections attributed to Coulter. We also have a reproduction of a sketch that she did, and it is signed, of Bright Angel Lodge. So they're out there.
And the one that she put her name and dated was not the one that was built. And if you go back and you actually look at the lettering on that, there's no question that's Robert Rainey's lettering. He was an accomplished architect. So was Lewis Curtis. So was Charles Whittlesey. You know, they didn't need Mary Colter to design concepts for these guys. You know, to design buildings. They were paying a price for it. In fact, even there's some stuff in the Santa Fe architect archive at the Kansas Historical Society, where, you know, the engineer for the railroad, you know, asked, did they want to have Curtis do a really nice building or just have one of the guys in the staff architects just design something that was utilitarian. So they did call them in for concept things. You know, I think that, you know, you really have to get back to where's the evidence that she actually designed the buildings. And there's a lot of allusion to things, but no one's got any actual drawings. I know you said she signed and put her initials on some drawings and that kind of thing, but none of the lettering is even like remotely close to hers.
Let me change gears a little bit. I've got something in the chat here that says the antagonistic tone of the Coulter critique is tough for me to get past. False, hoax, I'll take credit for that. I'd be more open to the research if it wasn't so negatively dismissive. Surely she did something good.
And Terry,
Did you give her credit for anything?
Yeah, I did. I said she was an accomplished decorator. She really was. She was great with color. Mm-hmm. She was good at doing the hotels and the restaurants and that sort of thing pretty economically. She reused different materials that you wouldn't have expected to. You know, she didn't necessarily design a lot of it, but she applied things in different ways. Mm-hmm. And, you know, whether you think I'm antagonistic, you know, facts are facts. And you know, if the facts don't support the idea that she's an architect, I don't see how that's antagonistic.
Well, and there is, and Haley, actually, would you like to, you put something in the chat of your own talk. I love that. Do you want to address what you had put in the chat so I don't have to read it?
This is just a photo. I didn't realize.
About the discussion I had with my friend. So my best friend, Rachel, she is also a professional interpreter, and she and I were discussing the possibility, the potential of, you know, 70, 80, 90 years ago, the word or the title of architect, maybe it was different. Maybe it had a different meaning. Like Linda and Arnold were saying, you know, maybe an architect was also a drafter. Maybe an architect was also this, was also that, you know, it could have been a mixture of different titles. So she very well could have, or other folks could have called her an architect, and that would have been acceptable at that time. If you look at the actual definition of the word architect, though, it has always meant, it's literally from the Greek roots to mean master builder. So, I mean, it's kind of, it's one of those gray areas. You know, I think this is a discussion we're going to be having for many, many, many years to come, and I'm enjoying it. I think you're muted, Jill.
I know. Hello.
Party foul.
I'm all thumbs. Matthew put this in the chat. As a layperson on this subject, I wonder, did Coulter ever actively profit or benefit from receiving these architectural credits during her own lifetime?
I would say she did not. She passed away in 1958. Is that correct?
No, 50, yes, correct.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
1958. So all of our buildings would have been completed after that. The Virginia Grattan book was written in 1980, and that was around the time that Coulter's name seems to really have exploded, at least within the guiding community. Maybe she gained some money from this, but I'm not sure. Fred, do you have anything?
You know, there was very little written in. The interesting thing is, you know, the articles that show up are always outside of Kansas City, which is where the Harvey family lived, at least the Kansas City branch that when the headquarters was there. And, you know, I think that, you know, possibly, you know, people could call themselves an architect back then, and possibly she felt because, you know, she was doing the interior, you know, there are interior architects, you know, even though she didn't do the drawings or that sort of thing, she was doing like the decorative aspects of it. And perhaps she felt that qualified her to be able to use the title of architect. But, you know, she doesn't, you know, in the true traditional sense of an architect, that's a little bit of license, I think. You know, it's in the interview with Charles Coverley that Virginia Grattan had, you know, he specifically says, you know, she didn't have anything to do with the buildings because the railroad owned them. And, you know, Virginia Grattan's book says that Coulter, you know, worked for the Santa Fe Railway, and there's no evidence of that, either in the railroad retirement records, which had to be turned in. And also there's correspondence from Coulter's co-workers that said that she never worked for the railway. She only worked for Fred Harvey.
Okay, well, Helen Ranny is in the audience, and she wanted to give Arnold Burke a few more minutes to chime in. Mr. Burke, I see that you're unmuted, and I see your forehead.
Okay, I'm now muted.
And maybe now you're muted again. If you unmute yourself, and then maybe if you could turn up your volume a little bit, because we can't hear you that well.
You want me unmuted? Hello?
And if you could turn up your volume a little bit, Helen has requested that you chime in a little bit more in the discussion. Mr. Burke?
On what subject?
Let's see, she says, I'd like to give Arnold Burke a few more minutes to respond to some of these questions, concerns. She's not specific. Helen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask him directly?
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and thanks Haley and Jill for putting it together. But I think we have two authors of books, and you know, Fred's been very has had a lot of time, and I just want to hear what Arnold thinks about some of the information that has come out at the end of this discussion regarding architect or not architect. Are you going to go back and do some more research about Mary Colter, or do you want to leave your book as it is and let the readers decide?
And Arnold, before you answer that, I just want to let you know we've got about 5 minutes left, and then I want to wrap things up. So try to be brief if you can.
I think the main thing I want to say, you know, the details of this whole discussion can be, you know, reviewed by all of us later on. It's not really the forum enough tonight, but I think I really appreciate Linda's talking about the nature of architecture and architectural collaboration, both back in Mary's day and currently. The contrast between the two, and especially how a building, when it's created, is such a collaboration of different people called architects or not called architects, but it's the idea that goes from A to Z, the actual building. And I think a lot of that pertains to the buildings that Coulter designed. The whole process may not be what we know it to be today. I hope I'm being halfway clear on that. But Linda made excellent points on all that.
Arnold, I actually concur with that, that what we think of today is not necessarily how things were back in Mary Coulter's day. And yet we're seem to be projecting the current arrangement of building design upon buildings that were designed over a century ago. And, I don't know that we can do that. I've actually tried to find, other sources that would define the process more in that day. It's difficult to do. And I don't know that you ever ran across anything like that either.
Brad, I can actually mention one. It's a book that I use. It's about 20 years old, but it's called, if I can get the name right, Architecture from Craft to Profession, and by a woman, I think it's Mary Woods. And it's basically a history of architecture, starting as a craft, as it might have been called then, all the way to becoming a practice in the present day. And it's an excellent review of, how things have changed in schools you now have to go to that you didn't, et cetera. But that book is a very good, I think, book for all of us to read. That's very relevant to this topic of Mary Coulter.
Arnold, it sounds very interesting. I do have to say, I was trying to go with something that was more of the period, in like an architectural publication of some kind that would have given more background on the projects and how they worked. And it was tough to find.
Excuse me, but that book, everybody should really get a copy of that. And just, there's an awful lot of quoting from historical material and footnotes,
Oh, good. Okay.
It's as heavy in footnotes as my book or your book, Fred.
Yes.
And I have Arnold's book in front of me right now, and I'm looking up in your bibliography. I'll go ahead and put the citation for Mary Woods's work in the chat, and you guys can
great.
write it
Thank
down. You bet. Please continue with your lively conversation. Trust me, I'll cut you off.
I don't have anything to add at this point, I guess.
Could I interject out of nowhere and ask Fred and Arnold, have you two met each other before? Have you engaged in this sort of debate before? I would imagine your names are well known to each other, if not your faces.
And I don't know if Arnold remembers, we actually did correspond when I first started on this, and it was about Lewis Curtis. I don't know if you recall that or not, Arnold. It was about 2015. And I know you said he was one of your favorite architects when you were researching that.
In fact, I was going to ask you tonight, are you still working on the Lewis Curtis biography, which is needed?
It is. I am. Unfortunately, I have a day job, so that interferes with my fun stuff with architecture and history. But maybe one of these days when I retire, I can really hit it. But I actually have got all my research done. Well,
good. I think that should see the light of day.
There's a fair amount of misinformation about Curtis too. Today it's easier to do things with the resources we have that people didn't have way back when to do the original story.
Yeah, that's true. Even when I did mine, there was a lot that was online 19 years ago. So
it was hard. It was much harder. My hat's off to you. It was much harder back then than it is today.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any other closing comments? Haley, please go ahead.
I want to say thank you to everyone for really polite and open-minded discussion. I did not expect that. I'm so proud of everyone. Yay, give yourselves a round of applause. Hey! No, I really appreciate that, guys. I just typed it in the chat, and I just want to say that, you know, this is so much more, this discussion we're all having is so much more than, you know, I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm wrong and you're right, or however you want to put it. And I think, like I said, this is going to be a discussion we're going to be having for a very long time. We're going to need to have, you know, more researchers coming in and testing these new theories, these new thoughts, these new ideas, and seeing where we can take them and where these theories will take us as historians, lovers of history. So I'm really excited for what comes next. So thank you, Arnold, for all you've put in with us today in the discussion. This has been great. Nice to meet you, by the way. I've read your book. And Fred.
And had I known that Fred and Arnold were going to be part of this, I would have probably organized this as more of a panel discussion. But like I said at the beginning of this program, this was literally supposed to be this really get your hair down, drink beer, fireside chat with Haley Johnson outside in the amphitheater at the grounds of Pioneer Museum in July. So, you know, I just morphed it into a different platform. And I had no idea that it was going to evolve like it did, which I don't know. Personally, I think this was a success. So yeah, I hope people didn't walk away feeling like frustrated or angry or like, see, I was right all along kind of thing. And I hope that it's just, you know, been, you know, something that people have been able to like gather all this information and think about it, and maybe it will morph into a discussion with your friends and colleagues, kind of like religion and politics. So now it's religion, politics, and Mary Colter.
And architecture.
I also want to let you know that that this presentation tonight was recorded. And it will be available in a few days. Just give us some time to get it uploaded. You'll be able to access it if you wanted to go back and see this again, or if you know of people who were unable to attend tonight, just let them know that it will be available for viewing in a few days. So,
can you tell me, will the chat be available also?
I don't know. Is there anybody left on my team that can address that? Oh,
Jill, we can make it available. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay,
that's very useful.
perfect. That was Sasha Siscona. So thank you, Sasha, for having my back.
great.
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff in the chat. You know, it kind of it's sort of like on a treadmill, and you've got to kind of keep up with it. So I apologize to anybody that had a burning question that I didn't get to. But perhaps if the speakers are open to further communication outside of this venue, that maybe they could put their contact information in the chat. And if you wanted to get in touch with them, then you'd have a lively conversation with all of us listening to it. So we can give you a couple minutes if you wanted to do that. About 3 minutes. We're going to cut it off at 7:30, but thank you so much, everybody, for showing up.
Well, thank
Appreciate
you, and
it.
thank Haley, and thank Sasha. It takes effort, I know.
Well, we work for the Arizona Historical Society, so we really have them to thank that we were able to put this on. So thank you, AHS.
Hey, Jill.
Yeah.
There were a couple chats in there, a couple comments in the chat that says, hey, let's do this again. And like you mentioned, maybe we can get, you know, snag Arnold and Fred again in the future. And because I think we need to keep continuing this discussion. This has been great.
Yeah. So maybe we can have that drink a lot of beer and hang out outside of the grounds.
Yes.
It's so much more fun to do it in person. So we'll see. We'll see. Just, you know, do your anti-COVID dances, everybody, and let's see if we can't get above and beyond this, or make it work so that we can all gather in person. That would be great. All right, guys.
Oh.
All right.
Thank you.
I think we're good to go. Thanks, Fred. It was nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too. Nice meeting you,
Fred.
Arnold.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good to see you, Haley. Thanks, Sasha. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.